The mansion stood like a fortress, its tall columns casting long shadows as the last remnants of daylight faded into the dark southern sky. The Caldwell estate had long been a symbol of power, wealth, and the colonel's iron-fisted rule. From the polished floors of the main house to the sprawling fields where the enslaved toiled, every inch of the land bore the mark of Colonel Thomas Caldwell's dominance. But within those walls, far from the prying eyes of the world, something dark was brewing. Colonel Caldwell, a man accustomed to having his way, had grown paranoid, his control over the plantation slipping away as discontent brewed among the very people he had enslaved for years. Power was his addiction, and he would do anything to secure it, no matter the cost. His wife, Eleanor, had long been a fixture in his life. Beautiful, poised, and dutiful, but even she had been unaware of the depth of her husband's cruelty. Forced into a marriage out of obligation, Eleanor had played her part as the perfect Southern wife, though her heart had always longed for freedom. Now, her husband had a new plan, one that would exploit the very thing he had once prized, her body. Tonight, the colonel made a pact, a sickening arrangement that would forever change the lives of 5 enslaved men and his own wife. It was a trade that would bind their fates together, and though the men were given a choice, none of them truly had the power to refuse. The price of loyalty, however, would be steep, and it would leave no one untouched. Before we step into this dark chapter of betrayal and manipulation, I want to know where you're watching from. What time is it in your world? What does it feel like to witness a man trade his wife for loyalty and the consequences that follow? Drop a comment below, and if stories of quiet rebellion and the breaking of chains speak to you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried deep for far too long. Colonel Thomas Caldwell paced back and forth in his study, his sharp boots clicking on the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent room. The walls of the study were lined with leather-bound books, trophies of his past military conquests, and portraits of ancestors whose wealth and status had paved the way for his own rise. He was a man who had everything except the one thing he could never fully control: loyalty. For years, Colonel Caldwell had ruled over his plantation with a cruel hand. The enslaved people had served him with the obedience born of fear, but there was always the nagging suspicion in his mind that they could rise up, that their resentment could boil over. His power was built on a shaky foundation, and he knew it. His wife, Eleanor, had long been his symbol of status, her beauty and grace admired by all who entered their home. She was a prize, a trophy wife, kept under his thumb, her every movement dictated by his rules. But now, Eleanor was more than just a wife. To Caldwell, she had become a bargaining chip, an object he could trade in exchange for loyalty. He had spent too many sleepless nights worrying about the growing discontent among his slaves, and in his desperation, he came up with a plan. A pact, one that would solidify his control over the people he ruled with fear. He stood in front of the window now, gazing out at the fields, watching the enslaved workers move in sync, each one a cog in the machine that kept his wealth growing. They were loyal, at least, that's what he told himself. But loyalty, true loyalty, was harder to come by. The idea had struck him suddenly, in the quiet of his study. What if he could solidify that loyalty by giving the slaves something they truly wanted, something they could never have on their own? His mind worked quickly, calculating the risks and rewards of the sickening proposition he was about to make. 5 of the most trusted slaves, John, Elijah, Marcus, Samuel, and Thomas, men who had served him well, who had proven their obedience over the years. He would offer them something that no one had ever dared to offer before. His wife, Eleanor. The thought sickened him, but it was also the answer to his problem. If he could control their desires, manipulate their loyalty by offering Eleanor as a prize, he could ensure his dominance for years to come. He could force them to remain loyal by stripping away their dignity, making them complicit in the very thing they had been oppressed by for so long. The deal would be simple. In exchange for their loyalty, in exchange for their silence and their service, the 5 men would be granted access to Eleanor's body whenever the colonel saw fit. His wife, the prize of his wealth, would become the currency of loyalty. It was a twisted, sickening plan, but to the colonel, it made perfect sense. The slaves, in his eyes, had no choice. They had to obey. As the colonel thought over the proposal, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was the sound of one of his trusted overseers, who entered without hesitation. "Colonel," the overseer said, his voice filled with nervous energy. "The men are ready. They've been called to the main house for the meeting." Colonel Caldwell straightened, his mind racing as he prepared to carry out the first stage of his plan. "Good," he said coldly. "Bring them in. It's time for them to make their choice." The overseer nodded, leaving the study to gather the 5 slaves. As the colonel prepared himself for the sickening transaction, his thoughts lingered on his wife, Eleanor. She would never know what he had done, not until it was too late. Eleanor, upstairs in her chambers, had no idea that her husband was about to bargain away her dignity, her body, and her future for a pact that would forever stain their lives. She was preparing herself for the wedding celebration that was soon to unfold, a night meant to be full of joy and ceremony. But the truth, as always, was far darker than the world she had been told to accept. The long, winding path leading to the mansion was lined with lanterns, their flickering flames casting an eerie glow over the grounds. The colonel's guests had begun to arrive for the grand celebration, their voices echoing across the estate as they marveled at the magnificence of the evening. Inside the house, servants scurried about, arranging last-minute details for the feast, their movements swift and practiced, just as they had been trained. Yet, amidst the bustle, there was an underlying tension, a quiet hum of fear that seemed to seep into every corner of the mansion. The colonel had prepared for this moment with the precision of a military strategist, each piece of the evening's festivities a part of a carefully orchestrated plan. But the real business of the night lay in the chamber just beyond the dining hall, where 5 of his most trusted slaves had been summoned. The air in that room was thick with uncertainty. The slaves knew they had been called for something important, but they did not yet understand the depths of what was being asked of them. Samuel, the eldest of the 5 men, stood at the front of the group, his hands clenched at his sides. He had seen enough of the colonel's cruelty to know that whatever lay ahead, it would be nothing short of vile. He exchanged wary glances with the others, John, Elijah, Marcus, and Thomas, each of them equally tense, uncertain of what was coming. They had been called to meet with the colonel, but none of them could have anticipated what awaited them behind the closed doors of the study. Samuel had heard whispers. The colonel had been making strange demands lately, acting with an arrogance that was palpable even in the way he spoke to the enslaved workers. Samuel had also heard murmurs of unrest on the plantation, the tensions rising among the enslaved, but he never thought that the colonel would go so far as to make a bargain this sickening. Yet here they were, standing in front of the man who controlled their every movement, awaiting the next twist in their already miserable lives. The door to the study opened, and the colonel entered, his posture straight and his gaze cold, his usual air of confidence unshaken by the moment's gravity. He looked at the 5 men, his eyes scanning each of them with the same calculating gaze that had earned him both fear and respect throughout the plantation. "You've all served me well," he began, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of command. "And tonight, you will be rewarded. I am offering you something that no one else in this world could ever offer you, something that will ensure your loyalty for years to come." The 5 men stood in silence, each of them processing the colonel's words. Samuel's mind raced. A reward? A reward for loyalty? He had heard enough of the colonel's empty promises to know that no good would come from whatever bargain was about to be made. The colonel's manipulation was well practiced, a game of control that left no room for refusal. "I've been thinking long and hard about this," the colonel continued, his gaze sweeping over the 5 men once more. "You see, loyalty is something that must be earned, and in my position, I need to ensure that loyalty is rewarded. But it's not enough to give you something that doesn't matter. No, I'm offering you something of real value, something that you will never be able to turn down." There was a brief silence, and then the colonel's next words hung in the air like a suffocating weight. "You will have her, Eleanor. My wife." The words struck like a thunderclap, reverberating in the small study, leaving the men frozen in shock. Samuel's heart raced, his pulse quickening, and the room seemed to close in on him, He stared at the colonel, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. "Her?" John whispered, barely able to form the word. The colonel nodded, a cruel smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "Eleanor," he repeated, "you will have access to her body whenever you desire. In exchange for your loyalty to me, you will have control over her. You will use her as you see fit." The room was silent as the men processed the horror of the colonel's words. Their minds raced, caught between the unimaginable betrayal of their own dignity and the hard reality of their existence. They had been subjected to the colonel's cruelty for years, but this? The colonel, a man who had used fear and violence to control them, was now offering them something even more degrading. His wife, the woman who had once been the epitome of his status, now reduced to a mere bargaining chip in his twisted game of loyalty. "I'll make it simple," the colonel continued, his voice laced with malice. "You want your families to stay safe. You want to be free from the harsher punishments. You want to keep your place on my estate without fear of punishment. This is your chance. But don't make the mistake of thinking you can refuse. You will take what I offer, or I will make sure you regret it." The men exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the offer and the threat settling heavily in the room. Samuel could see the uncertainty in the eyes of the others, their reluctance clear, but also the fear. Fear of the colonel. Fear of the consequences of saying no. But Samuel had never been one to bow to fear. He had endured far worse in his life, far worse than any offer the colonel could present. Still, the price was steep, and he could see the temptation flickering in the eyes of the others. The thought of having Eleanor, of having power over the one person the colonel cherished, was a cruel and twisted form of control. But it was power, and in their world, power was something that came at a price. The colonel stepped forward, his face cold and calculating. "I trust you understand the gravity of this pact. I've already made my offer. Think carefully, because this is your only chance." For a long moment, there was silence. The weight of the colonel's words hung heavily in the air as the 5 men struggled with the choice laid before them. Samuel knew what they were all thinking, that in accepting the colonel's offer, they would betray not only Eleanor but their very souls. But refusing it meant certain punishment, punishment far worse than anything they had yet faced. Finally, it was Samuel who spoke, his voice calm and measured, but filled with a quiet, unmistakable fury. "We'll do it. But you'll regret this, Colonel. You've made a grave mistake." The colonel's eyes flashed with satisfaction. He had secured their loyalty, and for him, that was all that mattered. "Excellent," he said, a malicious grin stretching across his face. "You will follow my rules, and you will make sure she knows her place." The pact had been made. The mansion seemed to suffocate in the heavy silence that followed the colonel's proclamation. The air hung thick with tension, as if the very walls of the estate were holding their breath, anticipating what would come next. Colonel Caldwell, confident in the power he believed he still held, turned on his heel and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving the 5 men to grapple with the horrific bargain they had just entered into. Samuel stood still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the door through which the colonel had exited. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, rage, disbelief, and something darker, more dangerous. The colonel had done what no one in the family had done before. He had taken Eleanor, the very embodiment of his control, and used her as a pawn in his twisted game of loyalty. But Samuel's mind was not focused on the colonel's cruelty alone. No, his thoughts were on the women and children, the lives at stake, and the harsh realities of the system that bound them all. John, one of the younger slaves who had been particularly loyal to the colonel, was the first to break the silence. His voice trembled, filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. "I can't believe this. I can't believe what we've agreed to." His eyes shifted between the others, seeking some sign of solidarity, some sense of reassurance. "Elijah," Marcus muttered, his voice low but strong. "This ain't what we signed up for. We've had to endure the worst of this, but this goes against everything we've ever believed in." But Samuel did not respond immediately. His thoughts were elsewhere, focusing on the plan he had begun to formulate in his mind. He understood what had been asked of them, what they had agreed to under the pressure of survival. But he also understood something deeper. This was a moment of reckoning. They had been forced into this situation, yes. But there were still ways they could turn the tables, ways they could reclaim the power that had been stripped from them, piece by piece, but they had to be patient. Samuel had learned that patience was the weapon of the oppressed. "Listen to me," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. The others turned their attention to him, waiting for some form of guidance, though none of them wanted to admit it. "We've been given a choice that we didn't want, but it's still a choice. We may not have the luxury of freedom, but we still have our minds, our wills. And we're not going to give those away." The words seemed to hang in the air, their weight felt by each of the men standing in that room. Samuel had given them a glimmer of hope, something they had been deprived of for far too long. "We will play along for now," Samuel continued, his eyes narrowing in determination. "But when the time is right, we will take back what's ours. We're not slaves to the colonel, not in here." He gestured to his own chest. "Not in our minds, not in our souls. And we'll make sure Eleanor knows that." The men nodded, a tentative agreement passing between them. They were trapped, yes, but they were not broken, not yet. The days that followed were a blur of forced obedience, a cycle of quiet manipulation and calculated distance. Samuel had been assigned to watch over the colonel's study, ensuring that nothing was amiss, while the other 4 men, John, Elijah, Marcus, and Thomas, were kept under the watchful eyes of the overseers. They were given what they had been promised access to Eleanor, but it was always under the colonel's watchful eye, under the assumption that his authority would remain unchallenged. For Eleanor, the change in her life was suffocating. The knowledge of the pact, the reality of what had been done to her, crept into her every thought. She was a woman forced to comply, to bend to the colonel's will, but she had never been as passive as she appeared. She had known her life had been a cage. But now, the bars were even tighter, and she could feel them pressing in around her. Each time one of the 5 men came to her chambers, she forced herself to stay calm, to appear composed. She had no choice but to endure. But beneath her surface, her hatred for her husband, for the man who had betrayed her trust and made her a pawn, grew with every passing day. Samuel was always different, though. When he came, there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a deep understanding of what they both faced. Unlike the others, Samuel never seemed to take anything from her without asking, without first giving her some sense of autonomy, even if it was an illusion. One evening, as Eleanor sat in front of her vanity, brushing her hair in the dim light of the candles, she saw Samuel enter quietly, as he had done so many times before. This time, however, there was something different in his manner. The air between them was charged with a tension she could not deny. "Eleanor," Samuel said softly, his voice carrying a note of respect, "I'm not here to take from you tonight." She turned to face him, her heart racing, unsure of what he meant by his words. Samuel had been kind, or as kind as he could be under the circumstances. But kindness was not enough to undo what had been done to her. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze was steady, but the tears she had fought so hard to hold back were threatening to break free. "To make sure you're still free in here," Samuel said, tapping his temple gently. "To remind you that they can't take everything from you. No matter what they do, they can't break your mind. And your soul?" He didn't wait for an answer, knowing the question hung between them, unanswered. Eleanor swallowed hard, then nodded, though her eyes were clouded with sorrow. She had never felt more trapped, more violated. But for a brief moment, Samuel had given her a glimmer of hope. She had not lost herself. Not yet. Later that night, after the men had left and the house had fallen silent, Samuel stood outside, looking out at the moonlit fields. His thoughts were heavy, his plans growing clearer by the day. The colonel's sick pact was not the end. It was only the beginning. The colonel might have taken control of their bodies, but Samuel knew that the mind, the will, could not be controlled so easily. And once they had broken the chains around their minds, the rest would follow. The days that followed the colonel's pact were filled with a tense and uneasy silence that hung over the Caldwell estate like a dark cloud. The slaves who had once served the colonel out of fear now moved with a heavy sense of guilt, the price of loyalty gnawing at their consciences with every passing hour. The pact had been made, Eleanor's body given as a currency to ensure their obedience. But the consequences of that decision were becoming clearer with each day that passed. The 5 men, who had once been able to hold their heads high in the presence of the colonel, now found themselves caught in a web of moral and psychological entrapment. They had each been given something they had long desired: power, control, the ability to have a small piece of what had been withheld from them for so long. But that power came at a price they hadn't fully understood when they had agreed to the colonel's twisted bargain. Each time one of them visited Eleanor's chambers, they were reminded of the ugliness of what they had become a part of. They were given access to her, yes, but it was never an act of love, never an act of genuine desire. It was a forced act of compliance, and with each passing encounter, they could feel themselves sinking further into a place they couldn't escape. For Samuel, the weight of the pact was different. He had never been one to accept the colonel's power over him. Not truly. He had always been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to make his move. But the consequences of the pact were eating at him too. He had not only betrayed his own dignity, but had also become a tool in the colonel's hands, a tool to control the others. The colonel knew exactly how to manipulate loyalty, how to twist it into something that would bind people to him forever. But Samuel had made a decision. He would not remain trapped in the web the colonel had spun, not for much longer. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself in the same cage, albeit a more gilded one. She had never felt more isolated in her entire life. Each night, the colonel would check on her, ensuring she was still compliant, still bound to his whims. He had begun to visit her more frequently, taking pleasure in the small moments of power he had over her, making her feel his ownership, even when he wasn't physically present. The house, once a place of opulence, now felt like a tomb, its silence a constant reminder of her captivity. She spent her days wandering the estate, pretending to take joy in the simplest things, tending to the flowers, walking along the gardens, but everything felt hollow. There was no longer any solace in these tasks. She could no longer escape the reality of what had been forced upon her. She had been traded, not only for loyalty, but for the illusion of power. The worst part was that she couldn't even confide in the people around her. Samuel, though sympathetic, was one of the men who had agreed to the colonel's terms. And the others, John, Elijah, Marcus, and Thomas, had their own burdens, their own guilt. She knew they suffered, but none of them could offer her the comfort she longed for. But Samuel, for all his quiet resolve, had one thing that the others didn't. He had the strength to stand up, even when the walls around them closed in. And Eleanor saw that in him, a flicker of hope, a possibility. One evening, when the estate was quiet, and the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the open windows, Samuel entered Eleanor's chambers once more. This time, his purpose was different. He had not come to fulfill the colonel's pact. He had come with a plan, one that would shift the balance of power, one that would free them both. Eleanor stood by the window, staring out at the darkening sky, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. She did not turn when she heard Samuel enter, but she knew it was him. His presence was always different from the others, calm, composed, but with a quiet determination that both unsettled and intrigued her. "Eleanor," Samuel said softly, his voice steady and low. "It's time. We can't keep playing by their rules." She turned slowly, her face pale but determined. "I don't know how much longer I can endure this, Samuel. Every time one of them comes into this room, I lose a piece of myself. And the colonel, he doesn't stop. He thinks I'm just a tool, but I'm not." Samuel stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're not a tool. You never were. The colonel thinks he controls everything, but the truth is, he's vulnerable. He doesn't see that what he's done has already started to destroy him. And now, it's time we make our move." Her eyes searched his face, hope flickering in her chest. "What do you mean?" Samuel's lips curled into a faint, determined smile. "The pact was never about loyalty. It was about control. But control can be broken. You're not the only one who can manipulate a situation, Eleanor. We can take back what's ours. You, me, the men, everyone who's been broken by him. The colonel doesn't realize it yet, but the game is already slipping out of his hands. We just have to take the next step. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest, the weight of his words sinking in. But what can we do? The colonel will never let go of his power willingly. That's where you're wrong, Samuel said, his voice cool and composed. The colonel has made a fatal mistake. He's underestimated the loyalty of his slaves. He's used fear to control us, but what he doesn't realize is that loyalty doesn't come from fear, it comes from trust. And he's lost that. The men, our brothers, are waiting for a sign. They're ready to break free. And once they do, once we all stand together, the colonel's power will be a memory. Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of what he was proposing sinking in. She had lived a life of fear, of submission. But now there was a path forward. It was dangerous. It would cost them everything. But it was their only chance at freedom. We'll need to be careful, she said quietly, her resolve solidifying. If we do this, there's no turning back. Samuel nodded. We don't need to turn back. We just need to move forward. And we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more time the colonel has to tighten his grip. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, a real hope that didn't come from the colonel's cruel promises. She had been given a choice. And now, together with Samuel, she would find a way to take back her life. The plan had been set into motion, quietly, carefully. Every step Samuel took, every word he spoke to the others, every glance exchanged between him and Eleanor was part of the strategy to take back what had been stolen. The first part of the plan was to build trust, to ensure that the 5 men, the ones who had entered the pact under duress, would stand with Samuel when the time came. He had chosen them for a reason. They were already living with the weight of their choices, and their guilt was as powerful a weapon as any. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension that hung over the plantation like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The colonel had no idea what was brewing beneath the surface of his carefully controlled world. The enslaved people moved through their daily routines, but there was something different in the air, a quiet defiance that lingered just beneath the surface. For Eleanor, the days were spent pretending, enduring the moments when one of the men came to her room, fulfilling the pact the colonel had forced upon her. But each time Samuel arrived, it was different. His presence wasn't just about fulfilling the colonel's demands. It was about a plan that would not only change their lives but tear apart the very foundation of the colonel's power. One night, after the last of the colonel's guests had retired to their quarters, Samuel met with the 5 men in the small, dimly lit room near the stables, where they had gathered many times before. The mood was tense, but there was a flicker of resolve in each of their eyes. They knew what they were about to do. There would be no turning back. "We move tonight," Samuel said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "The colonel believes he has us under his thumb. He believes he controls everything. But tonight, we show him that he doesn't." Elijah, the youngest of the 5 men, shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "Are we really ready for this? If the colonel realizes what's happening, there's no telling what he'll do. He's dangerous." "I know," Samuel replied. "But the longer we wait, the more power he has over us. We have to act now. Eleanor can't endure this much longer, and neither can we. We take back what's ours tonight, and once the colonel is exposed, the rest will follow." The others exchanged glances, their faces filled with uncertainty. But there was a quiet fire in their eyes. Samuel could see it. They were ready. They had no choice but to be. Marcus, who had always been the most vocal of the group, spoke up. "You're sure this will work? The colonel's not the kind of man who lets go of power easily." Samuel's gaze was unwavering. "That's why we have to move fast. We'll strike when he's least expecting it. We don't need to overpower him, we need to expose him, to make it clear that his power is nothing but an illusion. Once that happens, the rest will follow." The room fell silent as the weight of Samuel's words settled in. They had all been a part of the colonel's twisted game for far too long. Now, they had a chance to rewrite the rules. Later that night, as the moon hung high in the sky, Samuel led the group to the colonel's study. The mansion was quiet, the sounds of the outside world muffled by the thick walls of the house. They moved in the shadows, careful not to alert the guards or make a sound that would tip off the colonel. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated. They reached the study, and Samuel signaled for the men to wait as he approached the door. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the handle, and then pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the colonel sat at his desk, his back turned, reading through papers. His thoughts, like always, were consumed with control. He had no idea that the world he had worked so hard to build was about to come crashing down. Without a word, Samuel stepped into the room, followed by the others. The colonel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock as he saw the group standing before him. "What is this?" the colonel growled, his voice thick with disbelief. "What are you doing in my study?" "Colonel," Samuel said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity, "you've built your empire on the backs of the people you've oppressed. You've used fear, manipulation, and lies to control everything. But tonight, you will see that your power was never real." The colonel's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his side. But before he could make a move, Samuel stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "No, Colonel, this isn't about force. This is about the truth about what you've done, the truth about what you've used us for." "What do you mean?" the colonel spat, his face flushed with anger. "You're nothing but slaves, every single one of you." "Not anymore," Samuel replied, his voice low and steady. "Not anymore." With a single nod from Samuel, the other men moved quickly, locking the doors to the study and standing guard. The colonel was trapped. His power was gone. For the first time, he was the one who was helpless. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to enter. Her heart raced as she stepped into the room, her eyes locking with the colonel's. She had been forced to endure his abuse for far too long. But now, she was not the victim anymore. She was the one who held the power. "You thought you could control me," she said, her voice cold. "You thought I was just a pawn in your game. But you've lost, Thomas. You've lost everything. And on they're not could know." The colonel's face twisted with rage, his body trembling with frustration. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat. "You think this will change anything? You think you can escape the life you've been born into?" Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I already have, and I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." The colonel's world had crumbled in an instant. His power, once so absolute, had been shattered by the very people he had tried to control. His empire had fallen, not through violence, but through the quiet force of rebellion, of loyalty turned against him. Samuel stood at the center of it all, his eyes locked on the colonel, who was now a shell of the man he had once been. The colonel had no more power over them, no more power over Eleanor, no more power over the men who had once served him. "Take him away," Samuel ordered quietly, and the men stepped forward to seize the colonel, dragging him out of the study and into the darkness of the night. The morning that followed the colonel's downfall was stark and unsettling, like the calm after a violent storm. The mansion, once filled with the sounds of opulence and control, now stood silent, as if it, too, were absorbing the weight of the events that had unfolded. The air was heavy with the knowledge that the very foundation of power, which had once seemed unshakable, had been reduced to rubble. Colonel Thomas Caldwell sat in the small, dimly lit room beneath the mansion, his hands shackled to the cold iron bars of the cell. The rich, embroidered clothes he had once worn with such pride were now torn and soiled, his face unshaven and weary. The master of the estate, the one who had commanded both fear and respect, was now nothing more than a prisoner, his authority stripped away by the very people he had sought to control. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now filled with confusion and anger, but most of all, with defeat. He had lost everything: his wealth, his land, his family. All of it had been taken from him, not by force, but by the quiet defiance of those he had never truly seen as equals. Samuel, the man he had enslaved and oppressed for years, had taken control with an unrelenting strategy. an intelligence Caldwell had never understood. And now, the colonel was left alone in the dark, facing the consequences of his actions. Outside, the world continued to turn, but for the first time, the colonel was not the one controlling it. Samuel stood at the center of the plantation, his eyes scanning the grounds he had worked for years to escape. The estate, once a symbol of the colonel's dominance, was now a place of freedom, a place where the enslaved could finally breathe, could finally live without fear. It was a feeling Samuel had dreamed of for so long, but now that it had come, it was bittersweet. Eleanor stood beside him, her eyes cast downward as she watched the men move quietly around the estate, securing the colonel's possessions, making preparations to leave. The mansion had been taken, but the true cost of what had been done weighed heavily on her heart. Though she had been freed from the colonel's control, the scars of her time as his wife, his possession remained. "You've done it, Samuel," she said quietly, her voice filled with both admiration and sorrow. "You've freed us all." Samuel glanced at her, his expression calm but filled with the quiet resolve he had carried with him for so long. "It wasn't just me, Eleanor. It was all of us. You were a part of this. You helped make this possible." She shook her head slightly, her fingers brushing the fabric of her dress as she took a step closer to him. "But you were the one who planned it. You were the one who saw the way out. I never thought it could be done, never thought the colonel would ever be brought down. He was untouchable in my eyes. But you proved me wrong." Samuel's eyes softened for a moment, and he nodded. "We all did. It wasn't just about taking down the colonel. It was about showing the world that the power he wielded wasn't real. It was a lie, built on manipulation and fear. And now, we get to live in the truth." But Eleanor's face clouded slightly, her gaze flickering toward the mansion. "What happens now? What becomes of the estate? Of everything the colonel built?" "The estate?" Samuel said with a quiet smile. "It's no longer his. It's ours. Yours too. You're free now, Eleanor. You don't belong to him anymore. This is your life now, and it's your decision what you want to do with it." Her eyes met his, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of freedom settle in her chest. She had spent so long beneath the colonel's thumb, trapped by a life of duty and obligation. But now, she was free to make her own choices, to forge a new path. The possibilities stretched before her like an uncharted horizon. The men who had once been bound by the colonel's oppressive rule now stood with Samuel, ready to leave the estate behind and seek their own futures. There was no going back for them, no returning to the lives they had once known. They had crossed a line, and now they would live with the consequences, freedom, but also the uncertainty of what came next. "Where will you go?" Eleanor asked quietly, her gaze lingering on Samuel. "What will you do now?" Samuel's eyes softened as he looked at her, and then at the men who had gathered around them. "We'll go north," he said. "There's a place for people like us. A place where we can build new lives, where we can be free, truly free." Eleanor nodded, her heart heavy with the enormity of what had just happened. It was not just the colonel's estate that had been torn down, it was an entire system of oppression, of control. And in its place, something new had begun to take shape. A world where the enslaved had the power to choose their own futures, where they could live without fear. As the group made their way toward the gates of the plantation, the sun began to set behind them, casting a soft, golden light over the land. The colonel's mansion, once the symbol of his dominance, now stood as a silent witness to the rebellion that had taken place within its walls. And as they walked away, each of them felt the weight of the past slipping away, replaced by the possibilities of the future. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with uncertainty. But they were no longer bound by chains. They were no longer slaves to anyone. Samuel, walking beside Eleanor, glanced at her one last time. "You're free now, Eleanor," he said quietly, "and so are we." The two of them walked away from the colonel's estate, from the world that had tried to break them, and toward a future where they would write their own stories, one of freedom, of choice, and of redemption. And in that quiet, profound moment, they knew that the world they had once known was gone, replaced by something much more powerful. the promise of a life without fear.